This will be intern installation number 2, looking at the science of art of coaching. In this topic, we'll look at communication, so instructions and cueing. So when we talk about instructions or communication and cueing, the literature tends to point to 3 different categories in how they categorize a coach's words to an athlete. The first is internal. Internal-based cueing or attentional focus directs the performer's attention to something on their body. So we might say, flex your hip, bend your knee, extend your back. So obviously you can see all those cues are directing the performer's attention towards something in their body. External, on the other hand, directs the performer's attention to something within the environment or their effect on the environment. So you might say, explode off the ground. You might say, jump towards this line. You might say, sweep your leg forward like you're breaking a glass window. So those all elicit or direct the performer's attention towards an effect on the environment or effect that movement or has within this working space. Neutral, on the other hand, is just lastly where you kind of let the performer dictate their attentional focus. You might say something like, sprint as fast as possible, jump as high as can, and the performer can kind of dictate, the attentional focus that they use. Now, this is important because external-based cueing is basically superior to internal-based cueing, specifically internal-based cueing, in just about everything, both acute and chronic, with an implement, cyclical, etc. External-based cueing is king. And we talked about here whether it be using implement. So implement-based sports would be like, a baseball. You swing a baseball bat to hit a ball. Those are both implements. Basketball, you're shooting a ball into a hoop. The ball is an implement. Things like non-cyclical would be just like single bouts of activities, like a vertical jump. It's not cyclical, a broad jump. Cyclical activities would be things like running, cycling, swimming, where you're repeating an action or movement over and over. As you can see here, external-based cueing wins out or is superior in terms of performance and also retention and transfer in basically all of those categories for both novice and expert athletes. You can see kind of the expert athletes there for neutral is also superior to internal, and in some cases superior to external for expert athletes, and you can see they're working with an implement or cyclical type actions. And this is, the reason for this is that expert-based athletes, are very knowledgeable in what works for their body, and they have found, the attentional focus or strategy that works best for them, and they are able to utilize that at their own kind of free will, right? Instead of a coach trying to, throw out generic external-based cues, even though it is superior to internal, but you're throwing out somewhat generic externally-based cues, those things might not register or click for the athlete, and sometimes letting those expert athletes kind of just use what is successful for them is actually beneficial or superior to external-based cues, and obviously, as a whole, internal-based cues. So the bad news about this is that external-based cues even though they tend to win out in terms of performance and long-term learning, they are not quite used by coaches to the degree that they probably should. This is a study by Porter et al. I believe it was 2010, but they looked at high-level track and field coaches, and what they found was approximately 85 of these coaches used internal based cues in the way they gave communication, they gave cues, feedback to their athletes, and this led to about approximately 70% of those athletes adopting an internal attentional focus when competing. So when these athletes were asked, what are you thinking about during, say, a 100-meter dash? What are you thinking about when you're jumping over hurdles? What are you thinking about when you're throwing a shot put? They communicated that they used internally focused cues. And we know that, again, we just covered internal-based cues in every facet of performance, every facet of skill is inferior to externally-based cues. And so we may be hurting our athletes by some of the words that we use, some of the feedback that we give, some of the communication that we are implementing with our athletes. And again, pretty obvious what this kind of creates is this kind of paralysis by analysis in a sense where you might say you gotta extend your hips and then you extend your knees and then you extend your ankles. You're talking about triple extension, and the athlete is working through their body step by step, and you create this kind of robotic or paralysis by analysis. The other thing you create is that many of our athletes, especially more novice-based athletes, may not know what their hip actually means. What do you mean by extend my hip? What does that actually mean? What do you mean by flex my spine? What do you mean by brace my core? They don't actually understand those things because, again, they may not have studied or aren't studying exercise science, biomechanics, etc. So those words that may feel pretty natural to us do not elicit that same response in our athletes, especially novice or youth athletes. And so as coaches, we have to find ways to be creative with our words. So from examples like explode out like a jet when you're talking about acceleration, or just that the first 1 to 3 steps of acceleration. Break a glass window with your knee. Again, we're talking about you want that violent hip flexion to obviously create a nice lever arm to drive back into the ground. You might say break a glass window with your knee instead of flexing your hip and flexing your knee. Break a glass window with your knee. Sprint like you're running in knee-high grass, or sprint like you're running in knee-high water. Again, instead of saying knees up, or lift your knees, or lift your thighs. Again, all internally based cues. Something like this, where they now are, they have this analogy or this image in their head of running in tall, knee-high grass. If you want to run fast in this environment, in knee-high grass, what do you have to do? You have to naturally lift. You have to naturally bounce over the grass in order to actually strike the ground with some force. If you don't, your legs are going to sweep through the grass, get caught up. You might trip and fall forward, etc. You might say if you want to reduce ground contact time. So again, an athlete is spending too much time on the ground. They have a loud ground contact. You might say, like, pretend like you're running hot coals or hot lava. Imagine a cheetah's chasing you. Explode away from the line like being shot out of a cannon. So this is an analogy-based one. Explode out like you're shot out of a cannon. They have that, they elicit a very vivid image with the athlete, and they try to kind of obviously have that effect within the environment. Explode off the ground like a rocket into space. Push the ground down. Drive the floor away from you. Throw the bar to the ceiling. So these are all creative ways that, so for example, in this instance, you're doing some sort of Olympic lift, or you want triple extension, or you want a powerful movement. Athletes, coaches traditionally might say, extend your hips. Get triple extension. They might say things like that, where you can be creative with your communication and say, just throw the bar to the ceiling. If an athlete is to throw a bar to a ceiling, they are naturally going to have to extend their hips, and their body's going to somewhat self-organize into a pattern that is really efficient. Again, you might say double knee bend into powerful hip extension. That might be a traditional Olympic lifting cue. Now the athlete's like, what the hell is double knee bend? I got to get into hip extension. You create this kind of, like I said before, paralysis by analysis. Rather than somebody that's a little more fluid and natural and organic, like throwing the bar to the ceiling, the athlete's body will self-organize in an optimal manner. So what makes effective communication? First and foremost, I think you have to set an intention or attention, or both of those. Create intent and guide attention to our athletes. When you guide, it's more of a complex movement environment. When you guide their attention, look for gaps. Maybe look at their hips. That creates attention, which will guide intention, and vice versa as well. When you create an intention, make a person miss. That will guide their attention to various information variables within the environment that they have to attend to in order to make someone miss. So set intentions that will guide attentions. Use cues that have a distance, whether it be close, far, or location. Again, jump away from the line, sprint towards the finish line, drive towards the ceiling, push the ground down. Location cues are great because it creates this clear picture or location within the environment that they're trying to elicit a change in. Use descriptive words and create these words that kind of match and mirror the intention of the activity. So, for example, if I'm talking about max velocity sprinting, I want words that are like the first 3 there: snap, whip, not drive. I'll skip that one. Sharp, quick. Things that create buzzwords that kind of match and mirror the qualities or characteristics of that activity. During top, max velocity sprinting, we want to be quick off the ground. We want to have short ground contact times. We want to be, those words that we use should be mirror those things. Now, during acceleration, we can use words like drive, push, extend that are naturally longer, and again, they match and mirror what acceleration is. It tends to be a little more patient about driving and pushing and getting a full extension or full push with each and every step. And we're not rushing that acceleration. So use words that kind of match and mirror or create images that match and mirror what the activity is calling for. Analogy-based learning is another great one. If I asked you, how did you learn the directions of like north, south, east, west? Well, never eat soggy waffles. Analogy-based learning tends to have higher retention. Use analogies, use stories. And then finally, use a relator or reflective strategy. So relator would be, I had this with an athlete, a baseball player, struggled to get into an RDL position. Okay, we used a PVC pipe in their back, it wasn't working, different cues, wasn't working. And I said, hey, they played second base. When the pitcher's in the windup, get into your ready position. And they got into, a fairly decent RDL position, a hip hinge position. It was something that they knew, something that they could relate to. So when you can relate things back to their sport, or things that they do on a daily basis within their sport, you can have higher success. And then use reflective. I think it's something that coaches should do more and more of, is ask more questions. Allow for some autonomy in those questions. Ask how, where, what they felt, what they were thinking, etc. Ask for feedback. Don't just blindly give communication or cues. Ask for that feedback. And we talked about in the first installation, this is a co-pilot process where we are working together. It's not me as the coach always knowing what is best, always knowing what's cue or communication or what feedback to give. You have to dig a little bit deeper, and you have to have your athletes be along for this process as well. Now, but be aware, something that I struggle with is try not to over cue. All right, it's pretty simple. You could talk about getting into a goblet squat, right? And you all of a sudden you find yourself saying, well, you got to make sure your feet are firmly on the floor, and you have your weight centered in the middle of your feet, not toward your toes, not toward your heels. Make sure you sit back, but also sit down. Make sure you keep a neutral spine and a big chest. Keep your head neutral. Get down to this certain depth, and all of a sudden you threw 10 different things at your athlete, and your athlete's like, whoa, what the hell? I'm overwhelmed. What cue or what piece of information do I actually focus on? Start with one small thing. In many cases, you don't cue at all. Just say, hey, squat, or just say, sit down. I just want to see what you're doing, and that way the athlete performs the movement, and now you can get some feedback from them, and also watch and evaluate and see how they kind of organize naturally and organically. I can't tell you how many times I've asked an athlete to squat or even do a hip hinge, and without maybe just giving them an example of me doing it, and then asking them to just try it on their own, how many times they've actually performed a very quality movement without me having to then give them this minute spiel with 8 different cues that they need to know before doing the movement. I just let them do it. Sometimes the best cue is no cue at all, and knowing when not to do or to say something and letting them self-organize. And how many times athletes have actually done things pretty damn well, and I just saved myself probably confusing and overwhelming my athlete. And again, we talked about reflector cues and before, or reflector feedback before. Give them autonomy. Ask them what they're thinking, what worked, what did they see or feel, and give them autonomy, meaning you don't have to cue and give feedback in every single repetition. You don't have to see every single repetition or set that they're working on. Give them chances to watch a set maybe, or not watch a set, and just let them kind of internalize it and let them think and work, and solve problems on their own. Again, we can't hold their hands on the sporting field. If I'm working with the pitcher, I can't be in their ear after every single pitch and say, hey, your elbow was a little bit low on this one. Hey, we need more external rotation on this next pitch. Hey, you got a better separation between the lower and upper half. We have to allow time. We have to allow opportunities for them to have ownership and autonomy without us bombarding them with feedback.